Hi, I'm Jason Anderson, and I will be going over the Battle of Stalingrad, the objective, build-up, types of fighting used, tanks, airplanes used, and the generals that were involved before we get into the battle itself. Some notes on the battle. The battle was a very important and strategic, vital industrial city, as it had more than just an industrial city importance to the Germans, as it had the name was important, the location for some other things that the Germans wanted that we'll get into later into this presentation. The German offensive, the battle started with a massive push into the city, but before all of that, there was the Operation of Barbarossa, which was the start of the invasion on the Eastern Front, Battle of Moscow, and the capture of Voronezh. Soviet resistance. The Soviet army was very dedicated into defending the city, which resulted in a lot of death throughout the war, or through that battle. But the Germans were also very dedicated, so it was a back and forth for a long time, for a couple months. The location took place in urban and ruined city, as it was destroyed through bombing, artillery. So it ended up in urban warfare, street-to-street fighting, very complicated fighting, not ideal whatsoever for soldiers on either side to be fighting in, as open land was much more preferred because you could set up so many more booby traps, you could be hiding in so many different places. The Soviet counteroffensive, the Soviets deployed a lot of counteroffensive tactics in order to push back the Germans, as they were very determined and a mean army, but so were the Germans. And the Soviets, their counteroffensives were more focused to encircle the German army, to cut off the resources and ultimately wipe them out and push them out of the city. Once they do, after the counteroffensive, the Germans do surrender. The German 6th Army surrenders after being encircled. And death, as it is one of the bloodiest battles in recorded modern history, for how short it was and the amount of death, really shows how terrifying the battle was. And the significance is that this was the first major defeat of the Germans, as they had been steamrolling all through Europe and the Western Front, and so far the Eastern Front up to that point. The build-up to the battle, Operation Barbarossa. Germany invaded Soviet Russia on June 22nd, 1941, and the Soviets were not expecting it whatsoever, as Soviet Russia and Germany had signed a peace treaty earlier before the war, that Soviet would not invade Russia, or Soviets would not invade Germany, because Germany did not want to have to worry about such a massive army on the Eastern Front when he was going into Poland and whatnot. But after Hitler decided to invade Soviet Russia, they went for the Battle of Moscow, which was from the winter of 1941 through 42. Germans went into Moscow and were able to take over Moscow, which then led them to capture Voronezh in July of 1942. They were able to go from town to town, and the capture of Voronezh was the next checkpoint before they got to Stalingrad. And Joseph Stalin had known that Stalingrad was the next checkpoint, so he then built up the city with many troops, tanks, and artillery, and was able to strategically hide them as he had time, and he knew that they had to travel to Stalingrad, and he already knew that they were coming, so he had time to let his commanders place all the troops, tanks, and artillery in spots that would best defend the city for as long as possible and start to push the Germans back. And on the left-hand side, you can see the map of Operation Barbarossa, and you can see how wide of a invasion it was. It wasn't just a single little poke into Russia. It was a full-blown Eastern Front invasion into Soviet Russia. Getting into the objective of the battle and seeing why Hitler really wanted to invade Stalingrad, as it was such a huge symbolic victory to Hitler, because Stalingrad was named after Joseph Stalin. If you take his last name, you can see where it fits in there. And if Hitler was able to steamroll through Stalingrad, it would put a bad look on Joseph Stalin and be a major blow to Soviet morale, which would help the Germans continue to roll into their next town to town, as also this city was in economic and industrial importance, because they were able to build many different tanks and military equipment there. That's why the town was such a pain to fight, because there were so many buildings and factories that they could hide in for the urban warfare. Stalingrad was also located on the Volga River, which was a major transportation route for getting resources, equipment. They could build the military equipment in Stalingrad and then put it on the Volga River and send it out to wherever they needed to. And if the Germans can get that, then they could cut off major supplies for the Soviets. And then one of the other major reasons that Hitler wanted to capture Stalingrad, as it was north of the Caucasus mountain oil fields, as Germany was starting to deplete their oil reserves, as they were just constantly just steamrolling from town to town on the Eastern and Western Front. They realized that they didn't have any resources that they could supply from their own country, so they realized that the Caucasus Mountains had oil fields that they would be able to utilize, and if they were able to, then it would give them so much more oil and fuel and everything they need as resources that they were dwindling down to at this point of the war. And on the right, you can see Stalingrad right before the battle. I guess not right before, but before the battle, and you can see how clean and not destroyed it is, and it's just a normal looking town. And above the building over here, you can see it looks like a picture of Joseph Stalin. Continuing with the objective of the battle, disruption of the Soviet supply lines. As we said again, the city of Stalingrad is located on the Volga River, which served a major transportation line for Soviet Union to get military equipment, resources, supplies all over Russia or wherever they needed to go. And if Germany was able to capture the city and the Volga River, it would be a major blow to Stalingrad and their ability to transport. And the strategic diversion, as Hitler knew, because how much importance the city had to Joseph Stalin, he would most likely put a lot of effort and resources and supplies over there to prevent Hitler from being able to capture the city. He was hoping it would pull from other battles that were that were going on across the Eastern Front. As if you remember the picture of the Operation Barbarossa, you can see just how massive the invasion was. It was from north to south on the Eastern Front. So he was hoping that Stalingrad would start pulling away from some of those other spots on the front so that it would start leaking. Hitler could start leaking in his way to capture different cities. And on the right hand side, you can see some supplies on the Volga River. There's a tugboat delivering supplies, so you could either grab supplies, deliver supplies, and go all over. And you can see kind of from like the shoreline, you can see how massive the river is. So you can get some pretty big boats in there and be able to carry a lot of heavy equipment to be able to get it out into deeper waters. Some types of the fighting used in the Battle of Stalingrad was urban warfare. As we said earlier, this is a major town basically with a lot of factories and be able to produce a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of buildings in there, and because it's a big town, it's urbanized fighting, which basically means street to street, building to building. Means enemies can be hiding up in windows, they can be hiding up in little foxholes, they could be almost anywhere. It's really just like you could be hiding in so many different spots, and that's what made this battle one of the most bloodiest, because a lot of the times the enemy didn't see the other enemy when they ended up dying because the other enemy was so concealed in an urban city. Which leads us into the defensive positions. Because Stalingrad knew that Germany would be coming into Stalingrad as their next objective, he was able to send those troops, tanks, artillery into really good defensive positions within and outside the city, including trench barricades, fortified buildings. You could really strategically place yourself in good spots as you have time to think about where you want to hide and defend yourself and where the most important spots are of the city. And then we get into siege warfare, which is the Soviet forces attempted to hold off the German advance and cut off their supply lines. And basically the Germans tried encircling the city. And if you remember earlier, we said that the Soviets had encircled the Germans. So this is showing that the Germans were trying to do the same thing to the Soviets. They were trying to surround the city to prevent any resources, supplies from getting into the city so they could hopefully starve them out, make them run out of ammunition, make them surrender, finish them off, whatever they needed to do in order to have complete 100% control of the city. And basically, because they were both the Germans and the Soviets were trying to do that, it made it a stalemate on both sides for quite a while. Some more types of fighting used in the battle would have been tank warfare. Both sides utilized their tanks very well, as this World War II was one of the biggest wars that would use tanks as much as they did, and how vital they were on both sides for the Allies and the Axis. The Germans would have been a little bit more advanced with their tanks, but they didn't produce them at high nut levels, and the Allies were not as advanced most of the time, but they could produce them at higher levels to be able to have more tanks than the Germans at all times. And for this battle, both sides would use them for offensive and defensive purposes. The Soviets, since they can get their tanks in early before the Germans got in there, would be able to hide them out, put them in strategic positions to be able to take out these large groups of Germans as they would try to enter the city. And then the Germans would be able to use it for offensive purposes, such as like helping being that front wall for their troops to get into certain areas, as ground fire from handheld guns would not be able to penetrate tanks. Aerial support. There was aerial combat, and there was also close air support and ground attack. So the fight for the skies, as planes would duke it out in the skies, was very vital, as both sides wanted victory over the air above over the Battle of Stalingrad, as whoever had aerial victory would be able to defend their troops on the ground and not have to worry about other planes getting into the sky. The troops on the ground would also have that safety of knowing that it's their planes in the sky and not have to question if it's an enemy coming for them. In the close air support, planes could get in close to the ground, close to the troops, drop bombs, dive bombs, strafe the ground with their machine guns, cannons, any of that to help their ground support troops. And if they could find any spots that either side was attacking from, like if the Soviets saw that the Germans were making an advance, they could make a strafe and drop bombs on them and whatnot. The partisan and guerrilla tactics saw by the Soviets working behind German lines. The partisans were more of an armed resistance, as they would have been better suited for fighting for a little bit longer. And the guerrilla warfare would have been like more individual fighters that could have sabotaged the Germans by anything. They could have messed with their trucks, their tanks. They wouldn't necessarily have been more looking for a fight as much as they would have been trying to slow them down, as the partisan tactics would have been trying to slow them down from a fighting standpoint. And the artillery barrages, both sides saw heavy artillery, as artillery could be used from long distance, safe distances away for offensive or defensive positions, as you could use it for an offense to push the enemy troops out of a certain spot, or you can use it for a defensive if your troops are getting overrun, or like troops are coming, the enemy troops are coming towards your friendly troops. You could use it to try and stop them and protect your friendly troops. And on the right hand side, you can see two Ju-87 Junker dive bombers, or it looks like three of them, entering the airspace of the Battle of Stalingrad. After talking about the equipment that was used on both sides, the types of fighting, we can talk about what military equipment that was used. So we'll talk about tanks. The Soviet tanks that were deployed, the most well-known tank of the Soviets that were deployed would have been the T-34. It was a medium tank, one of the most important tanks, not just for the Soviets, but for the Allies in general, as it would have most likely come off the production line with a 76.2 millimeter gun. Some of them would have been off the production line with a 57 millimeter gun, and then later in the war, after this battle was done with, the Soviets put a 85 millimeter gun on the T-34 to make it more of a tank destroyer, a heavy tank to be able to take out some of the more advanced German tanks at the end of the war. But overall, during the time, the T-34 was a maneuverable tank, very well suitable and a very well fierce competitor for the Germans. The KV-1 was a heavy tank, which meant that it was its score was based off of a weight scale. Typically, the heavier tanks are more well armored, so they're going to be able to withstand anti-tank rounds better from maybe other tanks, from ground troops. So it would have been, it had a lot of thick armor. It had a 76.2 millimeter gun, and it had many different variants that came, but none saw the Battle of Stalingrad, as they all came in later from the KV-1. And then the T-60 was a light tank with a 20 millimeter cannon, and it was very light, very cramped, thin armored, which made it it was able to hide a lot better than the T-34 and the KV-1, as it was so much smaller. It can hide in so much smaller crevices, so it could be used for reconnaissance, be used for well maneuvering. It could be hidden, so because it's so much smaller, it'd be so much tougher for other tanks, for other ground troops on the other side be able to detect it before it would be able to get that information to their troops of the Soviets. Of the Soviet tanks that were deployed would have been the Su-76. It was a medium tank that had a 76.2 millimeter gun. It was off the chassis of the T-70. But yeah, it would have really helped the troops on the ground for these Soviet tanks, as they could put them in really well defensive positions and be able to really well hold off the Germans and help fight back. Be diving into the German tanks that were deployed, as they had the Panzer III. It was a medium tank with a 50 millimeter gun. It was well suited for helping the troops on the ground, being that medium tank that was a mix between a medium and a light tank. Because of its gun size, it wasn't necessarily going to be able to take out too many tanks from the Soviet side. And then we get into the Panzer IV. So this is the next model up. And it was another medium tank, but however, this one was deployed with a 75 millimeter gun. So this one would have been more suitable for attacking other tanks or well-defended positions that a heavier gun could punch through. And then the Tiger I was the most feared tank, one of the most feared tanks in World War II by the Germans, as it was a heavy tank that had really thick, strong armor that not a whole lot of tanks could penetrate. And on the top, that had a really big 88 millimeter gun that could pretty much slice through almost any Allied tank like butter. And there wasn't a whole lot that could fight back with it until later in the war. But at this point in the war, it was pretty much the top dog of tanks. Continuing with the German tanks, we get the Stug 3, as it was used by the Germans. It had a Panzer III chassis, but it didn't have that swiveling 360-degree turret on top, as they had to use the tracks to be able to aim the main gun. It had a 75 millimeter gun, but you can see it's a short barrel in the picture on the left, which would have made it less accurate for further distances. A long-barreled gun would have made more accurate shots for longer distances. So this is a tank that, because it has such a low profile, it could be hidden within the tree lines and make it really tough to spot out. So this tank would have been good for hiding, to be able to get in hidden positions, and then by the time it fires upon the enemy, it would take them a while to figure it out, because it doesn't have a tall profile like many other tanks with their 360-degree swivel turrets on top. Moving on from the tanks, we'll move on to the planes deployed. The Soviet planes that were deployed would have been the IL-2 Sturmovik, which would have been a heavily armored ground attack aircraft, as it was a slow turning, heavy armored plane. It's kind of known as like the flying tank because of how well armored it was. It isn't the official nickname, but some know it by that. It had a rear gunner because it wasn't made for dogfighting, so any plane that would try to take it down, it was a two-person plane, so there would be one in the back shooting with its machine gun to try to take that other person down. And then we have the Yak-1 and Yak-9. They were both fighter aircraft made for air-to-air combat. Both were well suited to be able to fight the Germans, and they weren't necessarily made to fight the ground for close air support or ground attack roles. It was typically just deployed for fighting to get that air-to-air victory in the skies above. And then the PE-2 was a twin-engine dive bomber. This plane, so a dive bomber would typically come up in the air. It would start level. Oh, wrong one. It would dive down, and then it would pull out at the last second and then fly off. And then because it's diving straight down almost at a 90-degree angle, it could just drop its bomb, and the bomb would fall pretty much where he was aiming at. So it made it way more accurate for hitting spots on the ground, which compared to flat level bombing runs would have been more of a carpet bombing type of style, which would have been just kind of more of destroy everything that you see in the area. You see your target, and then it wasn't as accurate as dive bombing. Dive bombing, you could be a lot more precise using mathematics in it. We went into the German planes that were deployed. They had the Messerschmitt Bf-109, which is one of the more well-known planes out of World War II from the Axis. It was primarily made to be an air-to-air fighter, and it was used from the very start of the war until the very end, and it was very well diverse in what it could do. There were certain ones that could be made for ground, not a whole lot, but it started out a lot different than what it ended up at the end of the war. As in the start, it had very light machine guns, and at the end, it had a very heavy 20mm nose cannon. So it was very deadly in the air, as that cannon in the nose could destroy a plane just with one hit. And then we have the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. It was a dive bomber made for close air support or for taking out troops or tanks or anything along those lines. And what we said with the dive bomber before, it would come in level, drop down to almost 90 degrees, and then it would level out after it drops its bombs. And anytime you hear the classic siren of like World War II, typically it came from the Ju-87, as it had a siren placed underneath its fixed landing gear. And that was more used as a mental tactic against the enemy, because anytime they heard that siren, they would know that the plane is diving down, and it would get in their minds and mess with their morale. And then we have the Focke-Wulf FW-190. It was a multi-purpose aircraft, as it all too was very diverse in what it could do. There were ones that were made for ground attack, recon, air-to-air combat. It had some of them had heavy cannons, some of them had bombs, some of them were made for high altitude fighting, some of them were made for more turn fighting. So the Germans were able to use their planes for many different diverse things in order to get what they wanted. Continuing on with the German planes that were deployed, we'll go into some of the bombers that they had for the bombing runs that they would put over the city of Stalingrad, try to flatten it out. They had the Junkers Ju-88, which was a twin-engine medium bomber, carry around 2,000 pounds worth of bombs. Because it was a medium bomber, it wouldn't go high altitude, so it was more accurate because it didn't have that heavy of a bomb load, so they had to be more precise. And because also it was a bomber, but not a fighter, it had multiple crew inside manning gun ports, and those gun ports would be able to defend itself from more than one direction while flying in a straight line. It was able to fly in daytime and nighttime missions. And then the Heinkel HE-111 was a twin-engine medium bomber. It had a state-of-the-art gyroscopic sight. and it could carry a little bit more than the Junkers Ju-88 at 4,500 pounds. As the HE-111 had seen a little bit more combat time at this point, as it was heavily used during the Battle of Britain when the Germans would bomb Britain. So they were able to understand the weak points of the HE-111, understand the strong points, and utilize that to the best strengths that they had knowledge of. And on the right hand side you can see both of them flying flat and level. Here we can see the cockpit of a Ju-87 Stuka during a dive bomb run. Again, the Ju-87 would have had a rear, it would have been a two-man plane, as it would have had a rear gunner because it was made for more of that ground attack role, close air support, so it wouldn't have been made for dogfighting. So it was a heavier plane, so it had a rear gunner, and in this picture it looks like the rear gunner took a picture of the pilot, and you can see how they're just facing, the entire cockpit's filled with the ground, so they're facing almost 90 degrees, and then once they get close, they will get as close to the ground as they can, and then they'll pull the bomb pickle button, and then they'll pull out of it. And a cool feature the Ju-87 had at the time was because it would pull so hard, when the pilot would push the bomb button, it had an automatic system to pull the plane flat and level, because a lot of the times pilots would pass out from G-lock, which is G-induced lock of consciousness, which is basically when all the blood rushes out of their brain from pulling so hard on the stick to get out of a dive. Get into the German generals and field marshals by the Germans. The Germans had Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who led the German Sixth Army. He was the lead man in the assault of Stalingrad, and he would ultimately be the one, a part of the German Sixth Army, that would be encircled and ultimately forced to surrender, ending the battle. But he had made a lot of progress into the city at the start of the battle, and then General Hermann Hoth led the German 4th Panzer Army, which would have been a tank army. So they would have worked in unison into attacking together, as having a tank and troop barrage coming into the city would have made defending the city of Stalingrad very difficult. Continuing with the German generals and field marshals, they had Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs. Von Weichs was the commander of Army Group B, which was during Operation Barbarossa, which would have been the large overview of all the troops, and everybody would have worked underneath him for the Operation of Barbarossa, which pretty much was the kickstart to ultimately what led up to the Battle of Stalingrad. And then you have Field Marshal Fedor von Brock. Von Brock initially commanded the South Group, Army Group South, but was relieved of his duties later on due to disagreements he had with Adolf Hitler. But both of these men would have been key figures in the Battle of Stalingrad for the Germans. Going to who the German Sixth Army was, as it was led by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, as I said in the last couple slides. They were part of Army Group B, so they were not their own necessarily large group, but they were working under a different, larger group. They would have had infantry, motorized armored divisions, so they would have had tanks, artillery, trucks, anything to move these guys, help defend them. And they were one of the most key essential groups to enter the Battle of Stalingrad and push back the Soviets at the start of the battle. And when they were paired with the 4th Panzer Army, it encircled the city, and their goal was to cut off the Soviets from resupply, to ultimately try to like starve them out, push them in, enslave, get POWs, prisoners of war, or finish them off if they didn't want to surrender. And on the left-hand side, you can see German 6th Army troops moving into the suburbs of Stalingrad. You have some of them holding grenades, their rifles, and other machinery as they move in. Continuing on with the German 6th Army, they had endured heavy casualties from the stiff resistance of the Soviets, as they were well defended within the city, so they would have had many deaths happen from within their group. And once winter hit, they were very unprepared. They did not have the winter equipment needed, so a lot of them would have had frostbite, they would have frozen, there would have been many problems. Their machinery would have had problems. They would have had like oil freeze ups, so they couldn't move machinery. And then when this German 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army encircled them, the Soviets ended up breaking out of it with a massive counteroffensive, which was a major turning point of the battle, as now it was the Germans on the defensive because they did not have the offensive advantage anymore encircling the Soviets. And the Soviets ended up surrounding the German 6th Army, cutting off it from their resources, and at the end of the war, the remaining group would end up surrendering, which would have signified the end of the battle, as it was the last group within the city itself. So we'll move into the German 4th Panzer Army. It was one of the major German army groups, as it was under Army Group B, commanded by General Hermann Hoth. They were mostly consisted of armored and motorized units, and they would have been spearheaded with the German 6th Army into getting into Stalingrad, as having heavy machinery, armored machinery enter the city first would have helped be a wall for the troops behind them that would have been entering the city. And on the left-hand side, you can see Panzer IVs with their 75mm guns, and then you can see half-tracks on the right-hand side, and half-tracks typically could carry troops inside. They could be used for anti-aircraft, or they could be fitted with machine guns. But those also would have been decently well armored against handguns or rifles or anything like that. You would have needed something a bit heavier to get through those half-tracks, and the Panzer IVs obviously would have needed heavy cannons to get through it. Going on with the German 4th Panzer Army, they were able to advance and reach the Volga River, and them being able to get to the Volga River was very vital again, as the Volga River was a major transportation hub for the Soviets. And again, with the winter coming up in Russia, the resistance would have, along with the winter and unpreparedness, would have really slowed down the 4th Panzer Army, and they ended up getting trapped when the Soviets launched a counteroffensive, as they launched many counteroffensives to never necessarily stay flat-footed within the battle, which ended up causing them to be heavy casualties, lose many tanks, half-tracks, trucks, a lot of their machinery, and remainders of the 4th Panzer Army were forced to surrender along with the German 6th Army. Any remainders that were not encircled would have been able to flee back into Germany at the time. The Soviet generals that were used within the battle, we have General Georgy Zhukov. He was the overall commander of Soviet forces used in the Battle of Stalingrad, so he would have implemented where defensive strategies would have gone, where the important buildings were, and ultimately would have been encircled. It coordinated the counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army, and his leadership and tactical skills would have helped morale and the advance of Soviet to push back and ultimately win at Stalingrad. And then we have General Vasily Chuikov, who commanded the Soviet 62nd Army that was within Soviet Stalingrad, and was able to use the buildings in urban warfare to the advantage of the Soviet 62nd Army, using close quarter combat, and using this would have ended up resulting in many deaths, ultimately on both sides, but the Soviets being able to have General Chuikov on their side to be able to utilize the urban warfare and command that would have helped the Soviets a lot more than the Germans. The other general that was major in the Battle of Stalingrad would have been General Nikolai Vatutin, as he was one of the key guys who launched Operation Uranus, which ultimately was the counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army and ultimately ended the Battle of Stalingrad, and was a major turning point at World War II at the time. Getting into who the Soviet 62nd Army was, they were formed on May of 1942 again to defend against Operation Barbarossa, as the Soviets had some idea, but they weren't necessarily totally prepared for it, because the Germans were able to steamroll through most of Soviet before they got to Stalingrad. And they were originally designated the 7th Reserve Army, and then it was redesignated as the Soviet 67th Army. Again, it was under command of General Vasily Chuikov, and was pretty much the main army that was able to take down the German Sixth Army, which was the major turning point for the Allies as a morale boost in taking back Stalingrad, as they also had tanks, artillery, infantry to defend Stalingrad, and they could use that to defend it, put it in strategic positions, and utilize the urban warfare that was at play. More about the Soviet 62nd Army is that it estimated that they have around tens of thousands of soldiers throughout the battle, as they could add more soldiers as they would lose them throughout the battle. So they had a continuous level of soldiers, and they wouldn't run dry. And they too also endured heavy casualties, as it was again one of the bloodiest battles. But what makes it more impressive was the fact that it had tens of thousands of soldiers, while the German Sixth Army had around a couple 100,000 in the battle. But they couldn't necessarily resupply their soldiers or get more soldiers as the battle went on, when they got trapped and whatnot, and were able to, and ended up falling off one by one before they surrendered. And then in picture on the left, it shows the Soviet 62nd Army hiding out and hanging out underneath a bridge, waiting. That's one of the strategic points they had in the urban warfare, is they could come and be in groups, and then were able to wait out for the Germans. And once the Germans showed up, they would be able to flank them and take them out. We'll be moving into the Battle of Stalingrad itself, and we'll be moving into more of a day-by-day what happened, now that we have a background of what happened leading up to the battle, and who, what, where, the equipment used, the types of fighting, the generals, all of that. So what kicked off all of Battle of Stalingrad was Operation Case Blue, which launched on June 28th, 1942. And the ultimate goal of Operation Case Blue was to secure the vital resources that Germany didn't have, such as the oil and the Caucasus regions and the industrial centers that Stalingrad had, and also like the Volga River for transportation. And then in the southern front, Operation Case Blue was part of the larger German offensive in the eastern front, which was more focused on the Don River to the Caucasus Mountains. And you can see the Don River runs, this is the Don River up here, it runs all the way through Stalingrad, and then the Caucasus Mountains are all the way down here. So you can see how big this front was, as they wanted to capture all of this and all the oil and resources. With Operation Case Blue, they had a lot of success under Field Marshal Fedor von Brock, and then later on in the operation it switched off to Marshal Maximilian von Weichs. But however, yeah, they made a lot of good progress in the beginning, pushed back the Soviets all the way back into before they got to Stalingrad. And in the operation, while they're pushing back the Soviets, they were able to capture a lot of key cities and regions that they needed for resources and whatnot. And they needed Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the ultimate objective outside of the Caucasus Mountains, because of the Volga River and both the name of the city and the industrial city that it was. And then on the left-hand side, you can see what the oil wells looked like in the Caucasus Mountains, as it had a ton of oil, which was desperately what the Germans needed to keep their tanks moving, their airplanes in the sky, as they did not want to run out. They wanted to keep a constant 24/7 battle with the Allies at all times. A picture of the what it looked like up in the Caucasus Mountains with the oil reserves. This would have been where they would have stored the oil. It looks like some of it got damaged, one of them. But yeah, it would have been in those big tubs, and they could store a lot of oil up in there, and you can see how much oil they really had, which is what the Germans really wanted. And the more important dates that happened throughout the battle all the way up until the end. So on July 17th of 1942, the German 6th Army started its attack on Stalingrad alone, as the German 4th Panzer Army headed south towards Rostov. German 6th Army had to initially attack alone without the tanks that the German 4th Panzer Army provided. And then the ultimate goal of Stalingrad, again, was to capture the city, cut off supply lines to the regions for the Soviets, and hopefully be a major turning point for the Germans in order to push back the Soviet and catch them off guard and push their morale down. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a German troop on the lookout as he's holding his gun in a little spot. It looks like in the city, as you can see buildings in the background. August 23rd of 1942, the German 4th Panzer Army finally links up with the German 6th Army, so now the troops of the German 6th Army have that comfort of knowing the tanks and armored vehicles of the 4th Panzer Army there to support them. And now they can really launch its main offensive in Operation Case Blue against Stalingrad, as now it has a huge force behind it, a big fist with the tanks to break through that initial defense that the Soviets had set up. Germans are able to take northern suburbs of Stalingrad, capture them. They're not into the city yet, but they're reaching it. And they also reach the Volga River, which is a major milestone for them. And the Soviets, having set up that strong defense, having all that time to do so, are able to slow the Germans down with their street fighting in their strategic defensive position with their tanks, artillery, ground troops, all of that. September 13th of 1942, the Germans are still capturing important areas like more suburbs, industrial areas, key transport hubs, anything they can really do to ultimately capture the entire city. They're just trying to capture bit by bit, not taking it at the whole. They're trying to take a little chunk at a time. But the Soviets aren't gonna allow the Germans to just steamroll their way through. So the Soviets are really slowing the Germans down, as the Germans had a huge, they had a lot of energy behind them entering the city, as they knew the importance of it. So the Soviets' job was to slow down the Germans. The very next day, on September 14th, 1942, the Soviets weren't going to allow the Germans to continue to take bit by bit of the suburbs of the outer area of their transportation hubs, and they're not going to allow them to set up camp on the Volga River. So they launch a massive counteroffense to regain the lost territories that the Soviets had lost, which resulted in heavy losses. And the Soviets were able to recapture several of the important positions, making the counteroffensive a success, as the Germans were in the offensive at the time. But the Germans were able to switch into a defensive mindset against the counteroffensive. So even though they were losing the positions, Germans were still able to fight back strong. And this resulted in many deaths, resulting in a stalemate, as at this point not much progress outside of the Germans making it to the city. The outskirts of the city has happened. On September 30th of 1942, the Soviet army, now knowing the offensive tactics that the Germans were using for the Battle of Stalingrad, were able to set up a defensive perimeter in the southern part of Stalingrad, also known as the Stalingrad Pocket, where they could fortify many factories, key areas, buildings, positions. So this would be this pocket was made to really stop the Germans and be a big fortified position, and the fact that they couldn't spearhead their way through and they had to really crawl for any real progress, as they were still on the streets of the urban warfare. So they would still be fighting building to building, street to street, that dangerous urban warfare, building window. But because the Stalingrad pocket was made to stop the Germans, it also proved to be tough for the Soviets, because the position that they were in for the pocket proved that they couldn't get supplies as easily as they were before, when they were all linked up together in the city. On October 14th of 1942, the Germans are now surrounding Stalingrad again, so the Soviets launch another counteroffensive to break that encirclement and break that circle that Germany is making, as they don't want to be fully enclosed, to cut off the supplies that they need to continue to fight off the Germans, because once they are encircled, it makes it that much more difficult to keep the Germans out of the city, as Soviets would be tough to resupply with troops, ammunition, food, clothing, any of that they need. So the counteroffensive involved a pincer movement, which is basically used to exploit weaknesses in a enemy's defensive line, or exploit an opportunity to encircle or defeat them. They can attack from two sides, so the multiple fronts, and they were just hoping to disrupt the German supply lines, and basically hoping, in the hopes of the supply lines being disrupted, they could break out of the circle that they were in from the Germans, and this all led to more fierce fighting in the streets. And the Soviets were able to push back the Germans in some areas, and them being able to push them back would have created these bubbles, which would have created thin spots, so that the Soviets could break through and break that encirclement. But the Germans were still putting up a defense against the Soviets when the Soviets were putting up their counteroffensives, as the Germans were smart in knowing that the Soviets were going to punch back. They weren't necessarily going to sit still. Once the Germans got into a offensive position, they had to switch to a defensive, as the Soviets then would have to switch back to a offensive position in order to start pushing back the Germans. November 19th, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, which would ultimately, what the goal was to encircle the German Sixth Army and destroy them, and ultimately they succeed in that. The operation had many troops, tanks, artillery in order to defeat the Sixth Army. As again, if you remember, German Sixth Army had thousands, like hundreds of thousands of troops. Maybe not all of them were at the same spot, but they were very well armored, experienced. They were very well defended, and were able to put up good offensive capabilities when needed. And a north and south pincer movement was carried out by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, targeting the Romanian Third Army. And again, the pincer movement was used to exploit enemies' vulnerabilities, attacking from multiple positions with the goal of achieving a decisive advantage by surrounding and overwhelming the opposing forces. But the southern pincer movement was led by General Nikolai Vatutin, targeting the German and Hungarian forces. As the Germans weren't necessarily alone when fighting, they had Romanian army and Hungarian. They had some Germans had some axes helping them out, and then the Soviets were successful with their operation in encircling the German Sixth Army, but it doesn't mean that they gave in. They still put up a fight for many more months. November 29th, 1942, the Soviets are still with their counteroffensive tactics against the Germans, utilizing street-to-street warfare, which ended up resulting in heavy casualties. But now that we're deeper into the battle with some more time under the belt of the Germans, they're now utilizing the buildings, their bunks, the factories. They're starting to set up defensive lines. They aren't necessarily on the offensive using the outskirts of the city anymore. They're now in the city, using the other buildings that the Soviets were once using, now to their advantage. So now the tide's kind of turning in the sense of who's utilizing defensive locations. But the Soviet counterattacks in the southern part of Stalingrad was able to push back the Germans, as they were able to get back some factories, defensive positions, and ultimately not necessarily keep the battle at a standstill as much. It was a back and forth. I mean, I guess you could call it a standstill, but both sides didn't necessarily bottom out. It was a back and forth, equal battle for a long time. But the German Sixth Army now being surrounded and getting their resupply is very difficult. The tightening of the encirclement, that was probably the biggest victory at the time for the Soviets, as it would ultimately be the biggest victory for the Allies, for the Soviets on the Eastern Front, as it would ultimately lead to the end of the war. November 16th in 1942, we see Operation Little Saturn under command of General Nikolai Vatutin. And the goal of Operation Little Saturn was to encircle and destroy the German forces in the Donetsk Basin, weaken the German army group's south, and relieve pressure on Stalingrad. As a lot of pressure within the city with the urban warfare was putting pressure on the Soviets. So The operation was to loosen up the pressure of the battle and start destroying some of the forces that the Germans had within the town. But before Operation Little Saturn, Soviets were making extensive preparations by gathering up large numbers of troops, building up and stockholding tanks and artillery, as they knew this was going to be a big operation. And the name has little in it, but it was a big operation and the ultimate end goal. On December 16th, 1942, the Soviets were attempting to flank and encircle the German in axes on the Donetsk Basin, but the Germans were aware of what the Soviets' plan was, so they decided to mount up a strong defense and make it really tough, which is really important to why Soviet had built up so many of their troops, tanks, and artillery, as they knew it wasn't necessarily going to be an easy easy offensive. But in the end, the Soviets ultimately became out victorious in this operation by encircling the German and Axis forces. Second, 1942, the Soviets are still continuing to push back the Germans with their offensive operations and that they're launching, and the Germans are continuing to fight back. It's still kind of a back and forth at this point. The only real victory they have over one another is Soviets have won Operation Little Saturn, and they have encircled the German 6th Army. Outside of that, the Germans don't have a whole lot of victories so far this battle. But both sides are still continuing to fight block by block, street by street, building by building, urban warfare, making a really bloody battle. Still many heavy sides. And a part of the offensive that the Soviets are continuing. They're making many gains in the southern parts of Stalingrad, getting back land and territories that they were losing at the start of the battle. And the German 6th Army's facing supply difficulties, as they're having food shortages, ammunition shortages, shortages of medical supplies. Now it's wintertime. Now they're starting to face the cold. They can't get cold gear to them, so some of them are getting frostbite, freezing to death, along with water shortages. They're starting to dwindle down, and they're not as much. Their morale is falling, so they're not as much of a fighting force as they were before they got encircled. January 10th, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Koltso, or Operation Rain, and now their goal is to finish off the German 6th Army. As before, they kind of just had them held there within Stalingrad. Now their goal is to finish them off. Now that they have the Germans pushed back enough on the outskirts of Stalingrad, so they're able to launch from multiple directions and create a big ring around them using infantry, tanks, and artillery. Basically, either giving them the option of either it's going to be death or surrender, because now they have resupply, the Soviets do, so they have enough troops, tanks, artillery, whereas the German 6th Army has been stuck there for the past couple months, running low on supplies, and their options are getting limited. January 26th of 1943 marks the major turning point of the Battle of Stalingrad, as Operation Koltso is a victory, as forces from Voronezh and Don fronts are linking up with the southwest and southern fronts to complete this encirclement of the German 6th Army. As you can imagine, there are roughly 300,000 soldiers within this encirclement, so the encirclement's pretty big. I mean, it takes a lot of troops to encircle 300,000 troops that are running low on equipment, food, anything like that, especially in the winter of January, with probably still summer clothes on. In general, Friedrich Paulus is still, and his staff are still within this encirclement and have been stuck there for quite a while. And now with this encirclement fully kitted out with troops, tanks, everything like that, any rescue or resupply that the Germans have for the German Sixth Army is practically impossible. So now like I said last slide, General Friedrich Paulus and his staff have two options: death or surrender. January 31st of 1943, General Friedrich Paulus is anointed a field marshal by Adolf Hitler, since no German field marshal in history has ever surrendered to any enemy. Either they have died to the enemy or killed themselves in battle. And Hitler, realizing that this operation to capture Stalingrad and the southern the Caucasus Mountains oil ranges is a failure. He does not want to make it as much of an embarrassment by now making Friedrich Paulus a field marshal. And now Field Marshal Paulus, facing dire situation with lower and lower resources, food, clothing, and more deaths within the group growing, is meeting up with his is having talks within the group of what he should be doing, and he's thinking to himself on what his options are of what he should do. As now Hitler's now biting his nails, and because he does not want to have that embarrassment of one of his big general, now field marshals, being captured in a war, having that to his name of an operation that he launched off. So now the Nazi Germany is now getting desperate in this point of the battle, as they literally know it's a defeat. So now it's more of how are they going to look after this defeat. February 2nd, 1943 marks the very last day of the battle, as Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrenders, and the rest of the German Sixth Army that are still alive, to the Soviet Army. Now that the German Sixth Army surrendered, there are no more German defensives within Stalingrad. The rest of them have been pushed out by the Soviet counteroffensives that they have consistently pushed throughout the battle, which now makes the Battle of Stalingrad a loss to the Germans and a major victory for the Soviets, as now the Germans have a major blow to their morale, and now they have to turn around and head back to Germany, which is a major turning point in the war. Roughly 200 to 300 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in this battle, making it one of the bloodiest, just from the German Sixth Army, roughly 200, 300,000 soldiers. Not in total, but that should just be, not in total from both sides, but just from the German Sixth Army, which should show how bloody this battle really was, how many bodies were stacked on top of one another in this short amount of time that this battle even took place. It didn't even take place a year, and that many people were killed, wounded, or captured. Should show the how devastating it was for both sides. And now Hitler basically has shot himself in the foot, proving that he isn't invincible. His army is beatable. There is, under right circumstances, the Nazis can be defeated. And now with the morale on the Allies, with the good morale on the Allies side, it's making beating the Germans much easier than it was before, when they were able to steamroll through every country that they faced. And then now Stalingrad has access to the Volga River again, and their buildings, factories, which is able to be a huge role in the rest of the war, as they're able to rebuild the city, rebuild their factories, use the Volga River, send out machinery to the Eastern Front for the Soviets. Here's a battle of after the Battle of Stalingrad. We can see right here is where the German 6th Army was surrounded. We can see the Don Front up here, the Voronezh Front, Caucasus Mountains, and we can see now that the momentum was on the Soviet side, we're able to push back. Army Group A, Army Group Don, some of the Italian groups, Army Group B all the way over here, Army Group South, which is this whole group. And so now you can just see how this encirclement, because this is all Soviet land, technically you could say all of this is just red, because the red signifies the Soviet, and then this little circle signifies where the 6th Army was. So they had nowhere to run outside of running into Soviet Russia, which would have been not any good whatsoever. The aftermath of the battle, it is a major victory for the Soviets, as it is a major loss for the Germans, and it is the first major defeat of the Germans in the battle, or in World War II up to this point, as typically they haven't really lost anything. They typically won every single battle, minor battle, everything up to this point. And again, it shows how bloody this battle really was, as it took place in about 5 months. It's estimated that about 2 million people were killed, civilians, military personnel, and troops, all of it. In that short amount of time, just the amount of death that took place shows how devastating the Eastern Front was compared to the Western Front, where this type of fighting wasn't necessarily seen as often. And then now with the loss of the German 6th Army and Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the German's army loses a bunch of its morale, and the army itself, with a lot of the troops, because there was a large number of troops that got captured and killed in this battle, marks a huge blow to the German army itself. Going on with the aftermath, the strategic shift goes on with the Allies, as the news on the Western Front, we have the American and British troops hearing the news about that, and they're able to use that morale to continue to push back the Germans, knowing that the Soviets are now starting to flip the tides, and now it's starting to become a squeeze into meeting the middle of Germany. It's the start of a loss, really, for Germany. And then the propaganda impact is it's used to show that Stalingrad is stronger than Germany and that they can beat them, which becomes huge for recruiting. Soviets can use it. It shows that how strong the Soviet military is, and for anybody wanting to join the Soviet military, they see how strong they are, and that's better for recruiting going on in the war, getting more troops. Closing statement is talking about how the Battle of Stalingrad was a huge victory for the Soviet Union, as it was a turning point for both the Eastern Front and the Western Front, but more importantly the Eastern Front, because that is the front that it was mentally impacted on the Western Front, but physically impacted on the Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler just wanting to get Stalingrad because of its name, when he could have easily gone around it, just to go to the Caucasus Mountains, shows he was shooting himself in the foot with his own mindset. His own incompetence started the loss of World War II. and started the strength, the fight back by the Soviets, as they had now that drive in them, as they were getting pushed back into Soviet Russia before the Battle of Stalingrad, and now they can start to squeeze with the Allies on the Western Front and push them into Berlin. The sources that I had used for getting the information for my slideshow. Thank you for listening and watching. Have a great rest of your day.